Today we'll be tying a canal tarpon pattern on the Allen SW003 hook. We'll also be using a slotted tungsten cone to provide some balancing weight as opposed to the standard dumbbell eyes you'd usually see on saltwater flies. I'll start my thread right about the halfway point, and I'll be using a bit heavier thread because we'll also be using deer hair with this pattern. For the tail of this pattern, I'm going to be using some webbier plumes of marabou. I want them to be about a shank to 2 shanks long, since I'm not particularly worried about these fish short striking. When I tie the marabou in, I'm going to force it down around the hook shank using my thumbnail. The goal here is to get that marabou base as thin as possible so that I can still get that cone head back over the marabou. At this step, I'm going to tie in a couple strands of crystal flash. I'll go a little bit more than I usually would, simply because I'm not too concerned about this fly being flashy. I want it to catch some attention. I'll tie in 3 strands, double them over, and tie them in on the other side as well. Now I'm going to whip finish and trim my thread free. Now that I've pushed the cone head back to my starting point, I'll start the thread in front of the cone head. I'm going to tie these in, much like the crystal flash, so that they're slightly longer than the tail of the fly. Double them over as usual and lock them down. Since I'm working with deer hair, I'm going to lock down my thread with another set of whip finishes. For a quicker fly, I could use a brush here or something that's a little easier to work with than deer hair. However, I want to use the deer hair because it's going to give me a more neutral buoyancy when balanced with this bead, and it's also going to push a bit more water. Start with your first clump of deer hair, making sure that the tips extend about halfway down the tail of the fly. I'm going to tie these in right at the bead, and they'll start to flare around the bead. Now I'll just force back that deer hair, put a thread dam, and continue adding clumps of it. At this stage, I'll trim off the tips of the deer hair just to make the trimming at the end a bit easier. Depending on how dense you want the head of your fly, continue to work forward, adding in clumps of deer hair. With this particular pattern, as a result of all the deer hair, I find it easier to use half hitches to complete the fly. Now, I'll use a razor blade to trim that head into a bullet shape. To add a bit more durability to the fly, since tarpon tend to thrash any flies you throw at them, I'm going to add a bit of UV resin and push that UV resin back into the base of the deer hair fibers. If you'd like, you can add a bit of extra barring to your marabou or any sort of extra additions you'd like to the fly. But here, you end up with a weighted fly without obvious exposed dumbbell eyes, so you have a nice tapered profile.